On a bitterly cold winter night in Nevada, a wild Mustang's desperate search for shelter would lead to a discovery that would shake a small town to its core. What happened next would change not only one man's life, but reshape everything we thought we knew about these magnificent wild creatures. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now back to the story. The winds howled across the Nevada desert like a mournful cry, whipping snow and ice into a frenzied dance across the barren landscape. For James Mitchell, a retired veterinarian living on the outskirts of Carson City, it was just another winter night in his modest ranch house. The calendar read December 15th, and the temperature had plummeted to a bone-chilling -10 degrees, unusually cold, even for Nevada standards. James sat in his worn leather armchair, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he pored over an old photo album. 20 years of treating animals in the area had left him with countless memories, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold on his doorstep. The first knock was so faint he almost missed it. It wasn't really a knock at all, more like a desperate scratching against his front door. Living in Mustang country, James was no stranger to wildlife, but something about this sound made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. As he approached the door, the scratching grew more insistent. What he found on his porch would haunt him for years to come. A wild Mustang, its coat covered in frost and ice, stood trembling before him. But it wasn't the horse's presence that made James's breath catch in his throat. It was what he saw in its eyes: pain, desperation, and something else. Intelligence that seemed almost human. The Mustang, a magnificent bay mare despite her current state, kept looking back toward the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. Her behavior was unlike anything James had ever witnessed in his decades of veterinary work. She wasn't running away, wasn't showing the typical fear wild horses display around humans. Instead, she seemed to be trying to communicate. "Easy there, girl," James whispered, his veterinary instincts kicking in as he assessed her condition. The mare's body bore signs of recent trauma, scratches and cuts that couldn't have been more than a few days old. But more disturbing were the peculiar markings around her neck, markings that looked disturbingly like rope burns. As James slowly approached, the mare did something that defied everything he knew about wild Mustangs. She stepped closer, deliberately, pressing her muzzle against his outstretched hand. In that moment, James realized this wasn't just a horse seeking shelter from the storm. This was something else entirely. The mare's eyes kept darting back to the darkness, and her movements became more agitated. She would take a few steps toward the blackness beyond the porch, then return to James, as if begging him to follow. 20 years of experience told him to stay put, to call the Bureau of Land Management, to follow protocol. But there was something in those eyes that spoke of urgency, of desperate need. James Mitchell had always been known as a by-the-book veterinarian, someone who never took unnecessary risks. But as he stood there in the howling wind, watching this wild creature that seemed anything but wild, he knew he was about to break every rule in that book. Grabbing his heavy coat and emergency medical kit, a habit he'd never broken even in retirement, James stepped out into the bitter cold. The mare immediately moved forward, looking back to ensure he was following. As they moved away from the safety of his porch light, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something bigger than himself, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about these magnificent creatures. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. The trail this mysterious mare would lead him down would uncover a story so incredible it would make headlines across the country and force authorities to confront a truth they never saw coming. And it all started with a knock on his door on a freezing winter night in Nevada. The wilderness beyond James's property was a maze of sagebrush and rocky outcrops, now rendered alien by the swirling snow. The mare moved with purpose, picking her way through the terrain with an urgency that seemed to grow with each step. James's flashlight beam bounced off ice crystals in the air, creating an ethereal tunnel through the darkness. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was madness. Following a wild horse into the Nevada desert during a snowstorm went against everything he'd learned in his decades of experience. Yet there was something about this mare's behavior that defied explanation. Wild horses don't seek out human contact. They certainly don't lead humans anywhere. But here he was, trailing behind this mysterious creature as if being pulled by an invisible thread. After about 20 minutes of walking, the mare suddenly stopped. Her ears pricked forward and her whole body tensed. James swept his flashlight beam across the landscape, and that's when he saw it, a deep ravine cutting through the earth like a wound. But it wasn't the ravine itself that made his heart skip a beat. It was what he heard coming from within it, the unmistakable sound of horses in distress. The mare nickered softly, and an answering call echoed up from the darkness below. James carefully approached the edge of the ravine, his flashlight revealing a sight that made his blood run cold. At the bottom, partially sheltered by an overhanging rock, was a group of horses, wild Mustangs, at least 8 of them. But these weren't free-roaming horses enjoying the protection of the natural formation. These horses were trapped. As James carefully picked his way down the steep slope, the full horror of the situation became clear. The horses had been corralled into this natural prison by carefully placed barriers, pieces of metal fencing and barbed wire strategically positioned to prevent escape. This was no accident. This was deliberate. The trapped horses were in varying states of distress. Some bore injuries similar to the mare that had led him here, rope burns, cuts and scrapes consistent with rough handling. Others showed signs of dehydration and exhaustion, but most disturbing of all was the sophisticated nature of their prison. Someone had taken the time to study this landscape, to understand how these horses moved, and to use that knowledge against them. James's mind raced through the possibilities. Illegal Mustang trapping still happened in these parts, despite the federal protections in place. Some captured horses ended up in slaughterhouses across the border. Others disappeared into the murky world of illegal horse trading. But this operation was different. The level of planning, the specific location, the careful setup. This wasn't the work of opportunistic criminals. This was something more organized. The mare that had led him here moved among the trapped horses, touching noses with several of them. James realized she must have somehow escaped this trap and, instead of running to freedom, had sought help. The intelligence and loyalty she displayed challenged everything he thought he knew about these animals. Using his veterinary skills, James began a quick assessment of the trapped horses. None appeared to have life-threatening injuries, but the situation was dire. The temperature was still dropping, and the horses had no access to food or water. The snow they could eat would only lower their body temperature further. They needed immediate help. James pulled out his phone, but as expected, there was no signal this far out. He'd need to return to his house to call for help, but as he turned to leave, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Among the barriers trapping the horses was a piece of equipment he recognized, a specific type of mobile corral panel that was only used by a handful of ranches in the area. And on that panel was a marking that made his blood run cold, a brand he knew all too well, one that belonged to one of the most respected ranching families in Carson City. The same family that had been making headlines recently for their vocal opposition to the federal protections of wild Mustangs. As James stood there in the howling wind, the pieces began falling into place. But the picture they formed was almost too terrible to contemplate. If what he suspected was true, this wasn't just about illegal horse trapping. This was about something much bigger, a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the community he'd served for 20 years. The Bradbury Ranch brand stared back at James like an accusation in the beam of his flashlight. The prestigious Bradbury family had been pillars of the Carson City community for 3 generations. Their patriarch, Richard Bradbury, sat on the city council and chaired multiple charitable foundations. His daughter, Sarah Bradbury, was the region's leading advocate for land development rights. The thought of them being involved in something like this seemed almost impossible. Almost. James's mind flashed back to the heated town hall meeting 3 months ago. Sarah Bradbury had stood at the podium, her voice passionate as she argued that the wild Mustang populations were damaging ranching interests. "These horses are not the romantic symbols everyone thinks they are," she had declared. "They're destroying grazing lands, competing with cattle for resources, and costing ranchers millions." At the time, James had dismissed it as typical political rhetoric. Now those words took on a far more sinister meaning. A sharp whinny from one of the trapped horses snapped James back to the present. He couldn't stand here theorizing. These animals needed help. But as he turned to leave, his flashlight beam caught something else. Half buried in the snow was a small black notebook. James retrieved it, his fingers trembling from more than just the cold as he opened it. Inside were meticulous notes, dates, times, horse movements, guard rotations at different Bureau of Land Management checkpoints. This wasn't just a random trapping operation. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign. The notebook detailed several other locations across the county where similar traps had been set. But more disturbing were the numbers in the margins. Prices, contacts in Mexico, arrangements for transport. The mare that had led him here nudged his arm insistently. She seemed to sense his hesitation, his struggle with the magnitude of what he'd discovered. James had always been the type to avoid conflict, to mind his own business. That approach had served him well during his veterinary career. But as he looked at these imprisoned horses, at the mare who had trusted him enough to seek his help, he knew there was no walking away from this. But calling the authorities wasn't as straightforward as it should have been. The local sheriff, Bill Hawkins, was Richard Bradbury's brother-in-law. The BLM regional director was a frequent guest at Bradbury Ranch fundraisers. How deep did this conspiracy go? James carefully photographed every page of the notebook with his phone before returning it exactly where he'd found it. The mayor watched him intently, as if understanding the gravity of his actions. He needed to document everything. Taking out his phone again, he began methodically photographing the trapped horses, the barriers, the brand on the equipment. A sudden gust of wind brought with it a new sound, the distant rumble of vehicles. James quickly killed his flashlight. The mare's ears pricked forward, her body tensing. Someone was coming. The regular patrols mentioned in the notebook. They were early. James had seconds to decide. Running back to his house would take too long, and the approaching vehicles would likely spot him. The ravine offered some protection, but hiding there meant being trapped with no escape route. His heart pounded as he weighed his options. The mare once again took the initiative. She moved quietly but purposefully toward a narrow gap between 2 rock formations, a path James hadn't noticed before. As he followed her, he realized she was leading him to a concealed vantage point. From here, he would be hidden, but able to see everything. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the swirling snow. 2 pickup trucks approached the ravine, their engines growling in the night. As they drew closer, James pressed himself deeper into his hiding spot, clutching his phone with its damning evidence. The mare stood perfectly still beside him, her presence somehow reassuring. The truck stopped and doors opened. Through the curtain of snow, James could make out 4 figures emerging. As they moved into the glow of the headlights, he recognized one of them immediately, Sarah Bradbury herself. But it was the man next to her who made James's blood freeze. It was someone whose involvement elevated this conspiracy from a local crime to something far more dangerous. State Senator Jack Morrison, the man behind the recent push to reduce federal protections for wild horses across Nevada. As James watched from his hidden position, he realized he was no longer just a witness to a crime. He had stumbled onto something that could shake the foundations of Nevada's political and social hierarchy. And as Sarah Bradbury's voice carried through the winter air, issuing instructions to her companions, James knew that his life and the lives of these wild horses would never be the same. From his hidden vantage point, James could hear every word carried on the bitter wind. Sarah Bradbury's voice cut through the night air with practiced authority, the same tone she used at town hall meetings and charity galas. "The transport's been delayed by the storm," she was saying, brushing snow from her expensive coat. "We need to move these horses to the secondary location before dawn. The BLM is doing their monthly aerial survey tomorrow, and this site will be visible from the air." Senator Morrison's response was terse. "This is getting messy, Sarah. First that mayor escapes and now weather complications. Maybe it's time to cut our losses." "Cut our losses?" Sarah's laugh was harsh. "We're talking about $500,000 for this group alone. The buyers in Mexico aren't going to wait, and neither are our friends in Washington. This program has to prove viable if we want the legislation to move forward." James's fingers, numb with cold, pressed the phone's record button. Every word was being captured, every damning statement preserved. The mare beside him remained eerily still, as if she too understood the importance of staying hidden. "Check the barriers," Sarah commanded two men James didn't recognize. "This weather might have weakened them, and get some tarps over the trucks. I don't want satellite imagery picking up suspicious vehicles out here." As the men moved toward the ravine, James could see their methodical professionalism. These weren't local ranch hands. Their movements spoke of military or law enforcement training. The operation was even more sophisticated than he'd initially realized. Senator Morrison moved closer to Sarah, his voice dropping lower, but still audible in the winter silence. "The committee votes next week on the land use bill. If this gets out, if anyone connects us to these disappearances—" "No one will connect anything," Sarah cut him off. "The narrative is already in place. Overcrowding, resource competition, environmental damage. The public believes wild horses are the problem. When the populations start dropping, everyone will assume they're just migrating due to climate change. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the new laws will be in place, and these roundups will be completely legal." The cynical calculation in her voice made James's stomach turn. This wasn't just about money from illegal horse trading. This was about changing laws, about creating a legal framework for what was essentially mass theft of protected animals. The trapped horses below were just the beginning. A sudden crack of thunder made everyone jump. The storm was intensifying, the wind driving the snow horizontally now. Sarah pulled her coat tighter. "Get the horses ready for transport. Sedate the aggressive ones. We move in 30 minutes. As the men climbed down into the ravine, James felt the mare beside him tense. The horses below began to stir restlessly, sensing the approaching danger. He had to do something, but what? He was outnumbered, and at least two of the men appeared armed. Even if he made it back to his house, who could he trust to call? Then he remembered. Nicole Martinez, the new BLM field director who had just transferred from California. She had no ties to local politics, no connection to the Bradburys. She had even clashed with Sarah at recent public meetings. If anyone would act on this evidence immediately, it would be her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But his house was a mile away through the storm. By the time he got back and made the call, these horses would be gone, disappeared into a network of corrupt officials and foreign buyers. Unless... The mayor nudged his arm again. Harder this time. When he looked at her, she was staring intently at something, his phone. Years of working with animals had taught James to trust their instincts. But what he was considering seemed impossible. Yet hadn't this mare already proven herself extraordinary? With trembling fingers, James pulled up his emergency contacts. Nicole's number was there. He'd saved it after treating her daughter's horse last month. The mare's intelligent eyes stayed fixed on him as his thumb hovered over the dial button. If he called now, his position would be revealed. But if he didn't, this evidence might disappear into the storm, along with any chance of stopping this conspiracy. Thunder cracked again, closer this time. Below, Sarah Bradbury was issuing more orders, her voice nearly lost in the rising wind. James took a deep breath, thought of all the wild horses that would disappear if this operation continued, and pressed dial. The sound of his ringtone seemed deafening in the winter night, despite being muffled by his coat. In the ravine below, voices suddenly went quiet. James saw Sarah Bradbury's head snap up, her eyes scanning the darkness. The mare pressed closer to him, as if lending him her strength for what was about to come. The ringtone seemed to echo through the canyon for an eternity. James frantically fumbled with his phone, trying to silence it, but the damage was done. Below, flashlight beams began sweeping the rocky terrain, searching for the source of the sound. "Someone's up there," one of the men shouted, his voice carrying over the howling wind. "Check the ridge." James heard Nicole's voice faintly through the phone. "Hello, Dr. Mitchell." But before he could respond, he had to move. The mare seemed to sense his urgency, already shifting away from their hiding spot, but she didn't head for the escape route they'd used earlier. Instead, she moved parallel to the ridge, staying just out of sight of the searching flashlights. Below, "Whoever's up there," Sarah Bradbury's voice rang out, cold as the winter air. "You're trespassing on private property. This is a legitimate roundup operation. Leave now, and we can avoid any unpleasantness." The lie in her voice was as clear as the danger in her words. James kept low, following the mare's lead as she picked her way through the rocks. He managed to whisper into his phone, "Nicole, this is James. Emergency at Crawford Canyon. Illegal. Roundup, Bradbury's involved. Senator Morrison here. Evidence on my phone. Sending location now." A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off rocks nearby. This wasn't a warning shot. They were shooting to hit. The mare didn't spook at the sound, but her pace quickened. James realized she was leading him on a route that kept rocky outcroppings between them and the men below. "Get that phone signal traced." Sarah's voice cracked with authority. "No one leaves this canyon until we find them." James heard vehicles starting up, their headlights sweeping the landscape as they began to circle the area. The mare suddenly stopped, her ears pricking forward. Ahead, James could see headlights approaching from the direction of the main road. They were about to be trapped between the two groups. But the mare had other ideas. She nudged James insistently toward a narrow crevice in the rocks, a gap he would have missed in the swirling snow. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it led to a sheltered gully that dropped away from the ridge. As they made their way down, James could hear voices above. They couldn't have gone far in this storm. Check every cave and crevice. The signals bouncing off the canyon walls. They could be anywhere in a 3-mile radius. The mare's choice of escape route proved brilliant. The gully not only provided cover, but also contained their tracks as the intensifying snowfall quickly filled them in. After about 10 minutes of careful descent, they emerged at the base of a different part of the canyon, well away from the trapped horses and searching men. James's phone vibrated, a text from Nicole. "BLM Tactical Unit dispatched, State Police. Notified, stay safe, keep evidence secure." But they weren't safe yet. The sound of vehicles was growing closer again. The mare's head came up, her nostrils flaring as she tested the wind. She turned to look at James with those intelligent eyes, and he understood they needed to keep moving. The storm was now reaching its peak, the wind driving sheets of snow that reduced visibility to mere feet. It was the kind of weather that could kill a person caught unprepared, but it was also their best chance for escape. The mare seemed to know exactly where she was going, leading James through the whiteout conditions with uncanny certainty. Behind them, James could hear the frustration in Sarah Bradbury's voice as she shouted orders that were increasingly swallowed by the storm. But her final words carried clearly through the night. "Find them. That evidence cannot reach the authorities. I don't care what you have to do. Nobody ruins 20 years of planning over one bleeding heart veterinarian and a runaway horse." 20 years of planning. The implications of those words hit James like a physical blow. This wasn't just about illegal roundups. This was about something that had been in motion since before Sarah Bradbury even took over the ranch. Something her father had started. Something big enough to involve state senators and international buyers. As if sensing his realization, the mare pressed closer, her warm bulk shielding him from the worst of the wind. They were now completely alone in the howling storm, cut off from both pursuers and potential help. But as James buried his fingers in the mare's frozen mane, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Because he wasn't just carrying evidence of a crime anymore. He was carrying the proof of a conspiracy that went back decades, and he had a feeling this remarkable mare knew exactly where they needed to go next. The storm had transformed the familiar Nevada landscape into an alien world of white. James could barely see 3 feet ahead, but the mare moved with unwavering confidence, choosing paths that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The wind carried distant shouts and the sound of vehicles, but the swirling snow made it impossible to tell how close their pursuers really were. James's phone buzzed again. Another text from Nicole. "Police roadblocks being set up on all major roads. But Mitchell, be careful. Just got word that Sheriff Hawkins is personally leading one of the blockade teams." The warning confirmed James's worst fears. The sheriff's involvement meant the corruption reached into local law enforcement. Any roadblock could be either help or threat. There was no way to tell which was which. The mare suddenly stopped, her head coming up sharply. Through the storm, James could make out the dim glow of approaching headlights. They were nearly at the main road, but vehicles were coming from both directions. The mare's ears swiveled, taking in the sounds around them. And then she did something extraordinary. She deliberately backed up, pushing James away from their original path. At first, he didn't understand, but then he saw it. Hidden behind a snow-covered bush was the entrance to what appeared to be an old mining tunnel. The mare nudged him toward it insistently. James hesitated. Abandoned mines were notoriously dangerous, but the sound of vehicles was getting closer. They had no choice. The tunnel entrance was partially collapsed, but there was enough space for them to squeeze through. James's flashlight revealed old support beams and rusted rail tracks leading deeper into the mountain. The mare showed no fear, walking confidently into the darkness as if she'd been here before. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, James's light caught something that made him stop. On one of the walls was an old sign, its paint faded but still legible. "Property of Bradbury Mining Co., 1962. Below it was a more recent addition, a small metal plate with a QR code and the letters BLC Project. James photographed both signs, adding to his growing collection of evidence. The mare waited patiently, but her ears remained focused on the tunnel entrance. The sound of vehicles was now very close. They'd have to go deeper to avoid being spotted. About 50 yards in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. James's flashlight revealed something unexpected: relatively new equipment, storage, containers, modern surveying tools. This wasn't an abandoned mine at all. It was active, but clearly off any official records. "What were you really mining here?" James whispered, more to himself than the mare. But as he moved his flashlight beam across the chamber, he got his answer. One of the storage containers was partially open, revealing stacks of documents. The label on the first folder he could see read, "Wild Horse Territory Reduction Initiative, Phase 1, 1965. The mare whinnied softly, drawing his attention to another part of the chamber. There, hidden behind some equipment, was an old desk. The drawer was locked, but James noticed something odd. The lock looked new despite the desk's age. Using a loose piece of metal as a lever, he managed to force it open. Inside was a single leather-bound ledger. As James carefully opened it, he felt the weight of history in his hands. The first entry was dated 1965, signed by Richard Bradbury Sr., Sarah's grandfather. The words on the first page made his blood run cold. Project Mustang Liberation commenced. First phase, document migration patterns. Second phase, begin strategic land acquisition. Final phase, legislative reform. Estimated completion 2025. The wild horses must be removed for the project to succeed. The mineral deposits cannot be accessed otherwise. 60 years. This conspiracy hadn't started with Sarah or even her father. It went back 3 generations. The Bradburys had spent 60 years systematically working toward this moment, buying land, placing people in key positions, slowly building toward a legislative change that would remove all protections from wild horses. And now, in 2025, they were in the final phase. The mayor's sudden tension alerted him. Voices were echoing from the tunnel entrance. They'd been followed. As James quickly photographed the ledger's pages, he heard Sarah Bradbury's voice. The old mine system. Of course. Father always said grandfather's insurance policy was still down there. Find them. That ledger cannot leave this mountain. James barely had time to close the drawer before the mayor was nudging him toward the back of the chamber. His flashlight beam revealed another tunnel, smaller, partially hidden behind fallen rocks. As they squeezed through, he realized this wasn't on any of the mine maps he'd seen posted. The mayor had led him to what might be their only escape route, but also into the heart of a 60-year-old secret that some people were clearly willing to kill to protect. The hidden tunnel was narrow and low, forcing James to crouch as they moved forward. His flashlight beam revealed decades-old boot prints in the dust. This passage hadn't been used in years, perhaps not since Richard Bradbury Sr.'s time. The mayor moved carefully, but purposefully, as if following some invisible trail through the mountain's heart. Behind them, voices echoed through the main chamber, accompanied by the sound of equipment being moved. Spread out, check every crevice. They have to be here somewhere. The voices were getting closer, but they held a note of uncertainty. Clearly, Sarah's team didn't know about this hidden passage. James's phone vibrated again. Nicole. Mitchell. Satellite thermal imaging shows multiple heat signatures converging on your location. But we've got a problem. Sheriff Hawkins is blocking our tactical team, claiming jurisdiction. We're 20 minutes out at least. Can you hold on? He didn't have time to respond. The mare suddenly stopped, her ears swiveling toward a sound James couldn't hear. Seconds later, a deep rumble shook the tunnel. Dust and small rocks rained down from above. They're using explosives to clear the blocked passages, James whispered, realizing the danger. They're willing to risk a cave-in to find us. The mayor's urgency increased, her body language clearly communicating they needed to move faster. The tunnel began to slope upward, and James noticed something strange. Small arrows carved into the rock walls at irregular intervals, barely visible under decades of dust. Someone had marked this escape route long ago, but why? What was so important about this particular path? Another explosion rocked the tunnel, closer this time. James's flashlight beam caught something metallic ahead. A heavy steel door set into the rock wall, its surface covered in rust, but its hinges surprisingly well maintained. Next to it was a plaque, half hidden under years of mineral deposits. Emergency access. Project Liberty. The mayor pawed at the ground near the door, drawing James's attention to something half buried in the dust, a key attached to a heavy brass tag. The tag bore the Bradbury family crest, but it was an older version, different from the one they used now. With trembling fingers, James fitted the key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, as if it had been regularly maintained, despite the door's abandoned appearance. As the door swung open, his flashlight revealed a sight that made him gasp. They were standing in a massive natural cavern, but it wasn't empty. Row upon row of filing cabinets stretched into the darkness, along with old computers, map tables, and what looked like geological survey equipment. This wasn't just a mine or a document storage facility. This was a command center, hidden inside the mountain itself. "My God," James breathed, moving toward the nearest filing cabinet. "This is where they planned it all." The drawer he opened contained surveys of wild horse territories dating back to the 1960s, each one meticulously annotated with mineral survey data. The Bradburys hadn't just been tracking the horses, they'd been mapping every valuable resource under the territories, planning decades ahead for the moment when they could finally access it all. The mayor's nervous wicker snapped him back to reality. They couldn't stay here long. James quickly began photographing the most damning documents, his hands shaking as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about Nevada. There were files here for wild horse territories across multiple states, all with similar annotations about mineral deposits, all part of the same long-term plan. A document on one of the desks caught his eye. A memorandum dated just 3 weeks ago. It detailed the final phase of Project Liberty, including a list of politicians, judges, and officials who were part of the conspiracy, each with their assigned roles in the upcoming legislative change. The names went all the way to Washington. Suddenly, the mayor's head snapped up, her whole body tensing. A new sound was echoing through the tunnels, the mechanical whir of what could only be modern surveying equipment. They were using ground-penetrating radar to map the mountain's interior. "Smart girl," Sarah's voice carried faintly through the rock. "She led him right to Grandfather's vault, the one place we couldn't risk destroying with explosives. Move in slowly. We don't want to damage anything in there we might need later." They were out of time. But as James turned to flee deeper into the cavern, he noticed something else. A modern laptop still humming on one of the desks. Its screen showed an active connection to the Bradbury Ranch's main server. Next to it was a USB drive labeled Project Liberty, Final Phase. The mayor's urgent nudging made it clear they needed to leave, but James knew this might be their only chance. He grabbed the USB drive and quickly plugged it into his phone, starting a file transfer. Another explosion rocked the cavern, closer than ever. Small rocks began falling from the ceiling as the mayor led him toward what appeared to be another tunnel entrance at the far end of the cavern. The file transfer seemed to take an eternity. Behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels. Just as the transfer completed, James's flashlight beam caught movement at the main entrance to the cavern. Sarah Bradbury stepped through, her eyes widening as she took in the scene and the evidence of their discovery. "Kill them both," she commanded coldly. "The horse, too. No one can know this place exists." The sound of multiple weapons being readied echoed through the cavern. But the mayor was already moving, pushing James toward the far tunnel with desperate urgency. As they dove into the darkness, bullets sparked off the rock walls behind them. The mayor seemed to know exactly where they were going, but would her knowledge of the mountain's secrets be enough to save them both? The new tunnel twisted through the mountain like a snake, taking sharp turns that seemed designed to confuse pursuers. The mare moved with incredible surety, her hooves somehow finding solid ground, even in near-total darkness. James's flashlight beam bounced off wet rock walls, creating disorienting shadows that made every turn feel like a potential ambush point. "You've been here before, haven't you?" James whispered to the mare as they paused at another junction. Her ears flicked back at his voice, and he could have sworn she nodded. The realization hit him. She wasn't just a random escapee from their roundup operation. She knew too much, moved too confidently through these hidden passages. A memory surfaced. 3 months ago, the Bradburys had reported a break-in at their ranch. Nothing was stolen, but their computer systems had been offline for days afterward. Around the same time, wild horse watchers had reported unusual behavior in one of the herds. Horses systematically probing the ranch's boundaries, as if looking for weaknesses. The mare's intelligence, her deliberate seeking of human help, her knowledge of these tunnels, it all pointed to something incredible. The wild horses weren't just random victims of the Bradbury scheme. They were active resistors, and this mare was proof of their adaptation and intelligence. A bullet sparked off the rock wall ahead, snapping James back to their immediate danger. The pursuit had caught up. Sarah's voice echoed through the tunnel. That horse knows these passages too well. Father always said some of them were too smart, that they'd learned our secrets over the generations. That's why we had to accelerate the timeline. More shots rang out, but the mare was already moving, taking them down a side passage so narrow, James had to turn sideways to squeeze through. His phone buzzed. Nicole again. "Mitchell, we've gotten through Hawkins's blockade. BLM tactical team 10 minutes out. State police helicopters launching. Just stay alive." The narrow passage suddenly opened into another cavern, smaller than the document vault, but just as surprising. This one contained old computer servers, their status lights still blinking. On the wall was a massive corkboard covered in maps and photographs showing the locations of every wild horse herd in Nevada. But these weren't the Bradburys' surveillance photos. These were taken from the horse's perspective, showing blind spots in the ranch's security, hidden water sources, and escape routes. "They've been watching us right back," James breathed, understanding dawning. "All these years we thought they were just wild animals, but they were studying us, learning, adapting." The mare's urgent nickering cut through his amazement. More voices were approaching, and this time from multiple directions. They were being boxed in. "Check the server room," Sarah's voice commanded. "That's where they track the herd movements from. Don't let them reach the surface exit." Surface exit. The words triggered another memory from the documents James had photographed. Something about an emergency ventilation shaft installed during the mine's early days, if they could find it. The mare was ahead of him, already moving toward a dark corner of the cavern. There, hidden behind an old server rack, was a metal ladder leading up into darkness. But it wasn't just a ventilation shaft. James's flashlight revealed modern climbing holds bolted into the rock alongside the ladder. Someone had maintained this escape route. "They're in the server room," a voice called out. "Take the shot." James felt something whiz past his ear as the mare practically shoved him toward the ladder. He began climbing as more bullets sparked around them. The shaft was wide enough for the mare to follow, the climbing holds apparently designed to accommodate both human and equine escapees. As they climbed, James's flashlight caught more of those small arrows carved into the rock, along with something else. Dates and numbers scratched next to them. With a jolt, he realized they were records. Dates of escapes, numbers of horses saved. This wasn't just a mine or a surveillance post. It was part of an underground railroad for wild horses, operating right under the Bradburys' noses for generations. The sound of pursuit grew more distant as they climbed higher. The mare moved, with practiced ease, as if she'd made this ascent before. Maybe she had. Maybe she'd been leading escapes for years, building on knowledge passed down through her herd. James's phone buzzed one final time before losing signal completely. Thermal imaging shows you're near the surface. Multiple heat signatures converging on your position from below. Helicopters 3 minutes out. Get above ground if you can. We'll find you. The shaft seemed endless, but James could feel a change in the air. Fresher, colder. They were getting close to the surface. But as the first snowflakes drifted down through the darkness above, a new sound echoed up from below, the distinctive click of a grenade pin being pulled. "If we can't have the evidence," Sarah's voice carried up the shaft, "then none of us will." The mare's reaction was instant and unexpected. She surged up beside James, pressing him against the shaft wall with her body, using herself as a shield, just as the explosion rocked the mountain. The question was, would her desperate gambit be enough to save them both from being buried alive? The explosion seemed to last forever, a cascade of noise and pressure that threatened to tear the mountain apart. The mare's body pressed James firmly against the shaft wall, her bulk protecting him from the worst of the debris that shot upward. The heat was intense, but the shaft's design, clearly engineered for exactly this kind of situation, channeled most of the blast's force downward. When the initial shock subsided, James found himself in near total darkness. His flashlight had been knocked from his hand in the explosion. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. The mare's breathing was labored but steady against his back, her presence reassuring in the darkness. "Still with me, girl?" James whispered, reaching out to touch her neck. His hand came away wet. Blood. She'd taken shrapnel hits protecting him. The realization made his throat tight. This magnificent creature had willingly put herself between him and death. A faint glow from above caught his attention. Starlight. The explosion had actually helped them, blasting away some kind of cover at the top of the shaft. They were close to the surface, but the mare was injured, and the shaft's integrity was questionable at best. From below came the sound of falling rock and distant voices. Some of their pursuers had survived the blast, but the explosion had bought them some time. The shaft would need to be stabilized before anyone could follow. James's hands found the climbing holds again. They seemed intact. "Can you make it?" he asked the mare. In response, she nudged him upward. Even injured, she was focused on getting them out. The climb was agonizing. Every few feet, small rockfalls would cascade down. The shaft. The mare moved more slowly now, clearly in pain but never stopping. James could hear helicopter rotors in the distance getting closer. The race was on. They needed to reach the surface before either their pursuers caught up or the shaft collapsed. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, James's reaching hand found empty air instead of rock. They'd reached the top. The explosion had indeed blown away some kind of metal cover, revealing a star-filled sky. The storm had passed during their time underground, leaving behind a crystal-clear night and a landscape transformed by snow. James pulled himself out onto the surface, then turned to help the mare. She emerged from the shaft like a spirit from another world, her dark coat dusted with rock powder and stained with blood, but her eyes still burning with that remarkable intelligence. They were on a small plateau near the mountain's peak. Below, James could see the lights of emergency vehicles converging on the area. A police helicopter's spotlight swept the mountainside, but hadn't spotted them yet. His phone suddenly buzzed, back to life with multiple messages. BLM tactical team on scene. State police have Bradbury Ranch surrounded. FBI en route, evidence of interstate conspiracy. Get to the north side of the mountain, rescue team waiting. But before they could move, a sound from the shaft made them both freeze. Someone was coming up fast, using powered climbing gear. Sarah Bradbury's voice carried up clearly. 20 years of my life planning this, 3 generations of my family's work. I won't let it end because of one bleeding heart vet and a too smart horse. The mare's ears flattened, and she moved to position herself between James and the shaft. But she was injured, exhausted. They both were. Sarah would reach them in moments, and from the sound of her voice she had nothing left to lose. James looked at his phone, at the precious evidence it contained, proof of not just the Bradbury's crimes, but of something even more incredible, the organized resistance of the wild horses themselves, their intelligence, their courage. If he and the mare didn't survive the next few minutes, at least the truth had to. He quickly attached all his photos and files to an email, sending them to Nicole with a single message. The horses aren't just victims, they're heroes, and I met the bravest one of all. The mare turned to look at him as he pressed send, and in her eyes he saw something that changed him forever. Recognition, partnership, trust. They were no longer just a man and a horse thrown together by circumstance. They were fellow warriors in a battle that had been raging silently for generations. Sarah's hand appeared at the edge of the shaft, gripping a pistol. The helicopter spotlight was sweeping closer. The mare tensed, ready for one final confrontation. In that moment, James realized that the most remarkable part of this whole incredible night wasn't the conspiracy he'd uncovered or the secrets he'd learned. It was the fact that when the moment of truth came, a wild horse had chosen to stand with him, to fight beside him, to trust him with her life and the future of her kind. As Sarah pulled herself up onto the plateau, the mare moved, but not to run, to stand. And James stood with her, ready to face whatever came next. The truth about the wild horses of Nevada wasn't just going to be revealed tonight, it was going to be defended by the unlikeliest of partnerships on a snow-covered mountain under the stars. Sarah Bradbury stood framed against the starlit sky, her expensive coat torn and dirty, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. The pistol in her hand gleamed in the moonlight as she leveled it at James and the mare. "You have no idea what you've done," she snarled, her voice rough with rage and exertion. This was never just about money. The mineral deposits under these territories could transform Nevada's economy. Thousands of jobs, billions in revenue, but the federal protection of these. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She waved dismissively at the mare. These animals made it impossible to access. The helicopter spotlight swept closer, but Sarah stood in its blind spot, hidden by an outcropping. Down below, sirens wailed as more vehicles converged on the mountain. Help was coming, but not fast enough. "They're not just animals," James said, his hand resting on the mare's neck, feeling her steady pulse. "You know that better than anyone. That's why your grandfather started this whole thing. He realized how intelligent they were, saw them watching, learning, organizing, and it terrified him." Sarah's laugh was harsh. "Grandfather understood the threat they posed. These horses. They passed knowledge down through generations, territory, water sources, safe routes, but also our weaknesses, our blind spots. Every time we thought we had them contained, they'd find another way out. That's when he realized we couldn't just remove them from a few specific areas. They all had to go." The mare's ears were focused on Sarah, her body tense but controlled. She was waiting, James realized, just as she'd waited and watched the Bradburys all these years. Learning, planning. "But you didn't count on them fighting back," James continued, thinking of the hidden tunnels, the marked escape routes, the years of documented rescues. "They didn't just survive your attacks, they built their own resistance network right under your feet." "Enough!" Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. "The evidence dies with you. By tomorrow this will all be a tragic accident. A foolish veterinarian caught in a storm, falling to his death, trying to help a wild horse. Poetic, really." The helicopter was drawing closer, its spotlight about to sweep their position. James could hear voices on the slope below, the rescue team racing up the mountain. But Sarah was right. At this range, she couldn't miss. There wouldn't be time for help to reach them. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The mare, who had been so still, suddenly tossed her head. The movement caught the first ray of the helicopter's spotlight, reflecting it directly into Sarah's eyes. It was only a split-second distraction, but it was enough. The mare's shoulder slammed into James, knocking him aside just as Sarah fired. The bullet meant for James grazed the mare's already injured shoulder. She reared up, not in pain or fear, but with purpose. Her powerful form silhouetted against the sky caused Sarah to stumble backward, closer to the shaft entrance. "No," Sarah gasped, suddenly realizing her position. "No, you're not that smart. You can't be." But the mare was already moving, her hooves striking the ground with deliberate force. The vibration was the last straw for the explosion-weakened shaft. The edge began to crumble under Sarah's feet. James lunged forward, trying to grab her arm, his veterinarian's instinct to help still strong. But Sarah Bradbury, heir to a 60-year legacy of deception and violence, wouldn't accept his help. She fired one last shot, wild, desperate. Before the ledge gave way completely, the helicopter spotlight finally found them, illuminating the plateau in harsh white light. The mare stood at the edge of the collapsed shaft, her intelligent eyes fixed on the darkness below. There was no sound from the depths. The Bradbury family's long war against the wild horses of Nevada had ended, not with legislation or roundups, but with the very intelligence they had feared and denied. James's phone buzzed. "Nicole, thermal imaging shows you on the plateau. Rescue team 2 minutes out. Are you okay? Is the mare?" He looked at his remarkable companion, seeing, past the blood and dust, to the true hero she was. "We're both okay," he typed back. "But there's something you need to understand about these horses, something everyone needs to understand." The mare turned to face him, and in the helicopter's bright light, he could see not just her injuries, but her resolve, her dignity, her undeniable sentience. She had trusted him with more than just her life tonight. She had trusted him with the truth about her kind, a truth that would change everything about how humans viewed and treated these magnificent creatures. As the rescue team's voices grew closer, James made a silent promise to the mare and all her kind. Their story wouldn't end here on this mountain. It would spread, forcing humanity to confront the remarkable intelligence that had been living wild and free among them all along. The true spirit of Nevada wasn't in the gold or silver or minerals, hidden beneath the earth. It was in the hearts and minds of the wild horses who had chosen to share their world with us. If only we were wise enough to see them as they truly were. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The rescue team arrived first, followed by BLM agents, state police, and finally FBI personnel. The plateau became a chaos of flashlights, radio chatter, and urgent voices. Through it all, the mare stayed close to James, her presence steady and calming despite her injuries. Nicole Martinez arrived with the BLM tactical team, her expression shifting from relief to amazement as she took in the scene. "James, we've got the ranch surrounded, the documents you sent. This is bigger than anything we could have imagined. But what happened up here? Where's Sarah Bradbury?" James looked at the collapsed shaft entrance, now being examined by emergency personnel. "She chose her legacy over surrender," he said quietly. The mare nudged his shoulder gently, as if offering comfort. "But that's not the most important discovery of the night." He led Nicole away from the crowd, the mare following without prompting. Under the starlight, James began sharing what they'd found in the mountain. Not just the evidence of the Bradbury's conspiracy, but the proof of something far more extraordinary. "Look at her," he said, gesturing to the mare. "Really look. The markings around her neck that I first thought were rope burns. They're not from captivity. They're natural patterns that help them identify each other in the dark. The horses have been using the caves all along, passing down knowledge through generations." Nicole's skepticism faded as she watched the mare's behavior, the way she responded to their conversation, her deliberate movements, her clear intelligence. "The satellite tracking data," Nicole said slowly. "We could never figure out how the herds always seemed to know when our patrols were coming, how they managed to disappear so completely. Because we were looking for animals acting on instinct, James finished. Not intelligent beings with a complex social structure and generational memory. The Bradburys figured it out decades ago. That's why they were so determined to eliminate them. Not just for the minerals, but because the horses were actively working against them. An FBI agent approached, tablet in hand. "Dr. Mitchell, we've begun analyzing the server room you discovered. The data there. It's unprecedented. These horses weren't just being observed by the Bradburys. They were conducting their own surveillance, using the natural cave systems to monitor ranch activities. There are patterns here that suggest organized behavior going back decades." The mare's ears pricked forward at this, and James could have sworn she looked pleased. "She wants us to understand," he said. "That's why she came to my door tonight, not just to save the trapped horses, but to finally reveal the truth." A commotion from the rescue team interrupted them. They'd found something in the shaft, Sarah Bradbury's body, along with a waterproof case that had fallen with her. Inside was another set of documents, these dating back to the very beginning of the Bradbury operation. "Listen to this," the FBI agent read from one of the recovered papers. "The horses show signs of cognitive development far beyond anything previously documented. They appear to be actively studying our operations, adapting their behaviors based on our patterns. Most disturbing is their ability to pass this knowledge to new generations. If this continues, all our plans for the territory will be compromised." A loud whinny from somewhere below the plateau caught their attention. The mare responded immediately, her call echoing across the mountain. More voices joined in, the trapped horses from the ravine, now being rescued by BLM teams. But there were other calls too, coming from all directions. "My God," Nicole whispered, "they're all out there. They've been watching us this whole time." Dawn was breaking over Nevada, the first rays of sun painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose. As the light grew stronger, James could see shapes moving in the distance, dozens of wild horses emerging from hidden valleys and concealed caves, their calls joining in what seemed like celebration. The mare stood proudly, despite her injuries, her role as ambassador between two worlds now clear. She had chosen this night, this man, this moment to bridge the gap between species. The evidence they'd gathered would protect the wild horses from the Bradburys' immediate plans, but James knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, convincing the world that these weren't just animals to be managed or resources to be controlled, but intelligent beings who had been sharing the landscape with humans all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. As if reading his thoughts, the mare turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the rising sun. In that moment, James understood that his role in this story was far from over. He had become part of something much larger than himself, a turning point in the relationship between humans and one of the most remarkable species on Earth. By midday, the mountain had become the center of a media storm. News helicopters circled at a distance, their cameras trained on the remarkable scene unfolding below. The wild horses hadn't retreated with the dawn. Instead, more had appeared, gathering in the valleys around the mountain in numbers that hadn't been seen in decades. In a makeshift medical tent, James watched as a team of veterinarians treated the mare's injuries. She remained extraordinarily calm, her eyes following the proceedings with clear understanding. The lead vet, Dr. Sarah Chen from UC Davis, had flown in specifically after hearing initial reports about the horse's behavior. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Chen admitted, carefully cleaning the bullet graze on the mare's shoulder. "The way she's cooperating, the way she seems to understand the purpose of each treatment. It's revolutionary." "And you say all the horses show similar levels of intelligence?" James nodded, sharing more details about what they'd discovered in the mountain. The FBI had already cordoned off the cave system, declaring it a crime scene, but also a site of unprecedented scientific significance. Teams of researchers were carefully documenting everything, from the horses' surveillance systems to their sophisticated use of the cave network. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with notifications. The story was spreading globally, aided by the dramatic footage of wild horses gathering around the mountain in what appeared to be a coordinated show of solidarity. Wild horse intelligence was trending worldwide. Nicole entered the tent, her face showing the strain of endless calls with Washington. The Secretary of the Interior is flying in tomorrow. The President's been briefed. James, they're talking about creating an entirely new classification for the wild horses, something between wildlife and an autonomous indigenous species. The mare's ears pricked forward at this, and she made a soft, nickering sound that seemed almost approving. "Doctor," Chen shook her head in amazement. "She's following our conversation. Actually following it. We're going to need to completely rewrite everything we thought we knew about equine cognition." A commotion outside drew their attention. One of the FBI agents burst into the tent, tablet in hand. "You need to see this," he said urgently. "We've decoded more of the data from the servers. The horses weren't just monitoring the Bradburys. They were documenting everything. Look." The tablet showed thermal imaging recordings, apparently taken from natural vents in the cave system. They showed years of secret meetings, illegal transactions, evidence of corruption that went far beyond wild horse territory disputes. The horses had been patiently gathering intelligence on every illegal operation in their domain. They weren't just protecting themselves, James realized. They were building a case, waiting for the right moment, the right person to share it with. He looked at the mayor, who met his gaze with what could only be described as satisfaction. More revelations followed throughout the day. Anthropologists discovered that local Native American tribes had legends about the wise ones, horses that were known to be far more than simple animals. Geological surveys confirmed that the cave systems used by the horses extended throughout Nevada, creating a vast underground network that they had been using for generations. As evening approached, James sat with the mayor outside the medical tent, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The other horses remained visible on the surrounding slopes, their presence a testament to a truth that could no longer be denied. A young reporter who'd managed to make it past the police cordon approached cautiously. "Dr. Mitchell," she called out, "everyone's asking, what happens next? How do we move forward with this new understanding?" Before James could respond, the mare lifted her head and let out a long, clear call. It was answered immediately by the surrounding horses, their voices joining in a chorus that echoed across the landscape. The reporter's camera slipped from her fingers as she stood transfixed. "I think," James said quietly, "they're telling us they're ready for dialogue. The question is, are we ready to listen?" The mare turned to look at him, and in her gaze was the wisdom of countless generations. A silent history of patience, resilience, and hope. The world had changed forever on this mountain, and they had all been part of it. But as James watched the horses gathering in the valleys below, he knew this wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between humans and one of the most remarkable species on Earth. 1 week after the events at the mountain, the landscape of wild horse research had transformed completely. The former Bradbury Ranch, now under federal custody, had been converted into a temporary research station. Scientists from around the world gathered there, drawn by the unprecedented opportunity to study what was increasingly being called advanced equine intelligence. James sat in what had once been Sarah Bradbury's office, now repurposed as a conference room, surrounded by leading researchers in animal cognition, behavioral science, and interspecies communication. The mare, whom researchers had begun calling Alpha for her role in the revelation, though James felt the name barely scratched the surface of who she was, stood calmly by the room's large windows, observing the proceedings. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a pioneer in animal language studies, was presenting her initial findings. The complexity of their communication goes far beyond anything we've documented in equine species. They're using a sophisticated combination of vocalizations, body language, and what appears to be a form of spatial memory sharing. The cave markings we've discovered suggest they've developed their own system of symbolic representation. The mare's ears twitched at this, and she moved to the center of the room. The scientist fell silent, watching as she approached a large digital map displaying the cave systems. With deliberate precision, she touched her nose to specific points on the screen, causing it to light up with contact recognition. Dr. Chen, who had stayed on as lead veterinary researcher, quickly pulled up the corresponding cave sections on her tablet. "These are all major junctions in their communication network," she said excitedly. "She's showing us their information exchange points." "Not just showing," James added quietly, "teaching. They've decided to share their knowledge with us, but on their terms, at their pace." The implications were staggering. Over the past week, more evidence had emerged of the horses' organized behavior. Trail cameras across Nevada had captured footage of their coordinated movements, their sophisticated use of lookouts, their ability to pass complex information through their herds. But more remarkable was their clear decision to now share this information openly with humans. Outside the window, on the ranch's sprawling grounds, more extraordinary scenes were unfolding. Groups of wild horses were voluntarily participating in cognitive studies, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that shattered all previous understanding of equine intelligence. They showed not just tool use, but tool creation, using branches to activate water pumps, arranging rocks to create shelters, even utilizing natural materials to treat injuries. A junior researcher burst into the room, tablet clutched excitedly. In her hands. "You need to see this," she said, pulling up a video. "We've been analyzing footage from the thermal cameras in the cave system. Look at this recording from 3 years ago." The video showed a group of horses clearly working together to help an injured member of their herd. But what made everyone in the room catch their breath was what happened next. The horses were deliberately recording their medical treatment process, positioning themselves so their actions would be captured by the cave's natural thermal vents. "They weren't just surviving," Dr. Rodriguez whispered. "They were creating a knowledge base, documenting their own discoveries for future generations." The mare moved to stand beside James, and he felt the now familiar sense of awe at her presence. Over the past week, their bond had deepened into something that defied conventional understanding of human-animal relationships. She wasn't just a subject of study, she was a colleague, a teacher, a bridge between two worlds. His phone buzzed with a news alert. The Senate had just passed emergency legislation establishing new protections for wild horses, acknowledging them as sentient beings with demonstrated advanced cognitive abilities. It was just the first step in what would clearly be a long process of redefining humanity's relationship with these remarkable creatures. But the most significant changes were happening on a smaller scale. All across Nevada, people were reporting new interactions with wild horses, encounters that showed the animals' willingness to engage with humans now that their true nature had been revealed. The horses were no longer hiding their intelligence. They were offering a chance for genuine cooperation between species. As the scientists continued their discussion, the mare caught James's eye and nodded toward the door. He understood. She had something else to show him, something beyond the scope of formal research. This had become their pattern over the past week, moments of scientific revelation balanced with private discoveries that reminded him there was still so much to learn. Walking beside her down the ranch's corridors, James reflected on how much had changed in just 7 days. The world had been shocked, amazed, and ultimately humbled by the revelation of what had been living wild and free among them all along. But as he was about to discover, the horses still had many more secrets to share. Secrets that would continue to transform their understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and the remarkable bonds possible between species. The mare led, James away from the bustling research center, past the new security checkpoints, and toward a section of the ranch property that bordered the original cave system. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Nevada landscape, and in the distance, other horses could be seen participating in various research activities. But the mare had a different destination in mind. She stopped at what appeared to be a solid rock face, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. James had passed this spot dozens of times in the past week, but now the mare pressed her nose against a specific point in the rock. A slight depression became visible, not natural, but worn smooth by generations of horses touching this exact spot. "Another entrance?" James asked softly. The mare nickered in confirmation, then used her hoof to scrape away a thin layer of packed dirt, revealing a narrow crevice. It was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they knew it was. There, James activated the new body camera he'd been wearing for documentation purposes, standard procedure now for all interactions with the horses. The mare waited patiently as he pulled out his flashlight and ducked into the crevice. Inside, the passage widened immediately, but it was unlike any of the other caves they'd discovered. The walls were covered in markings, not just the directional arrows they'd seen before, but elaborate patterns that seemed to tell stories. As James's flashlight beam moved across the surface, he realized he was looking at a historical record, carved and maintained by generations of horses. "This is incredible," he breathed. The mare stood beside him, her presence reassuring in the dim light. She moved forward deliberately, leading him deeper into what was clearly a sacred space for her kind. The passage opened into a circular chamber, and James's flashlight revealed something that made him gasp. The walls were covered in detailed maps, not just of the local cave systems, but of migration routes across the entire American West. The horses hadn't just been monitoring the Bradbury Ranch. They'd been maintaining a complex network of safe passages and sanctuaries across multiple states. But it was what lay in the center of the chamber that truly took his breath away. A natural stone formation had been carefully modified over what must have been centuries, creating what could only be described as a teaching space. Worn smooth depressions in the rock formed a circular arrangement, like an amphitheater in miniature. The mare stepped into the circle and did something James had never seen before. She pressed her hoof against different points on the ground, in a specific sequence, and suddenly the chamber was filled with a soft, natural light. James looked up to see that the horses had engineered a system of reflective surfaces that could channel daylight deep underground when activated. Under this natural illumination, the true magnitude of what he was seeing became clear. This wasn't just a meeting place or a record-keeping chamber. This was a school, a place where horse knowledge had been passed down through generations. The markings on the walls weren't just historical records. They were lessons, carefully preserved and updated over time. Dr. Rodriguez's voice crackled through his radio. "James, the thermal imaging is picking up some unusual readings from your location. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he responded, his voice filled with awe. "But you're going to want to bring a full documentation team down here. The mayor. She's showing me their education system." As if to confirm his words, the mayor began to demonstrate. Moving around the chamber, she showed how different combinations of hoof pressures could activate various natural lighting configurations, each illuminating different sections of the walls. It was a sophisticated teaching tool, developed and refined over countless generations. James noticed something else, Small indentations near some of the wall markings contained different materials: clay, specific types of rocks, even carefully preserved plants. These weren't just illustrations. They were teaching aids, carefully maintained supplies used to pass on knowledge about medicine, navigation, and survival. "This changes everything," he said softly. The mare turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw both pride and caution. She was sharing their most sacred place, their center of learning, but there was also a clear message in her bearing. This knowledge came with responsibility. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the chamber, and the mare's ears pricked forward. She touched her nose to one of the wall markings, a pattern James now recognized as their symbol for weather. Then she looked at him expectantly. James studied the marking more closely and understood. This chamber wasn't just for teaching history and medicine. It was also a sophisticated weather monitoring station, using the cave system's natural properties to track and predict atmospheric changes. The horses hadn't just adapted to their environment, they had developed an intricate understanding of its patterns and rhythms. As they stood together in that ancient place of learning, James felt the weight of the trust being placed in him. The mare and her kind had chosen this moment to share not just their intelligence, but their wisdom, a distinction that was becoming clearer with each new discovery. The question was, would humanity prove worthy of this trust? The discovery of the horse's educational chamber sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Within hours of James's initial report, a carefully selected team of researchers had been assembled to document and study the site. But the mare made it clear that access would be on the horse's terms, carefully controlling the flow of information in a way that demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of knowledge sharing. Dr. Rodriguez sat cross-legged in the chamber, tears streaming down her face as she watched a group of young horses being taught by their elders. The mare had arranged this demonstration, showing how their teaching methodology worked in practice. The younger horses moved from station to station, learning to activate the different lighting configurations, studying the wall markings, and practicing the sequences that would become part of their shared knowledge. "It's not just intelligence," Dr. Rodriguez whispered to James. "It's culture. They have a fully developed system of education, complete with teaching methodology and curriculum progression. We're watching the equivalent of a university that's been operating undetected for generations." The mayor stood nearby, overseeing the proceedings with what could only be described as professorial dignity. Over the past few hours, she had demonstrated how their teaching system incorporated not just practical knowledge, but what appeared to be history, ethics, and even artistic expression. The wall markings included not just factual information, but stories, cautionary tales, and celebrations of significant events in their history. James's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from around the world. The initial footage he'd captured had gone viral, forcing a global reassessment of how humans viewed and treated animals. Philosophy departments were wrestling with the implications of discovering such advanced cognition and cultural development in another species. Religious leaders were issuing statements about the spiritual significance of the revelation. But perhaps most significantly, other reports were beginning to come in from around the world. Indigenous communities from various continents were stepping forward with their own stories of horse intelligence and organized behavior. The horses, it seemed, had been sharing their knowledge with sympathetic humans for centuries, but their accounts had been dismissed by modern science. A young researcher named Maya Chen approached James, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "We've been analyzing the weather prediction markings," she said, holding out her tablet. "They're not just tracking storms, they've been monitoring climate patterns over decades, maybe centuries, and look at this section here." The mare moved closer as Maya pulled up a detailed image of one wall section. The markings showed a clear pattern of environmental changes, including what appeared to be predictions for the coming years. If their interpretation was correct, the horses had developed a sophisticated understanding of climate change long before humans had recognized the crisis. They've been preparing, James realized, looking at the mare. That's part of why they maintained this knowledge system. They knew they'd need these survival strategies as the climate changed. The mare's response was to lead them to a previously unexamined part of the chamber. Here, the markings showed what appeared to be adaptation strategies, new migration routes, alternative food sources, and methods for finding water in increasingly arid conditions. But more than that, they showed examples of horses and humans working together to address these challenges. They're not just showing us their past, Dr. Rodriguez said slowly. They're showing us a possible future, a partnership. As if to emphasize this point, a new group of horses entered the chamber, led by several that James recognized from the rescued herd. The mare greeted them with obvious satisfaction, and James understood. This wasn't just a historical preservation site or a school. It was becoming a true center for interspecies cooperation and learning. One of the younger horses approached a section of wall that appeared to be blank. Under the mare's supervision, it began to add new markings, recording the events of the past week. James watched in amazement as the young horse depicted not just the rescue and revelation of their intelligence, but also the beginning of this new chapter in horse-human relations. The implications were staggering. The horses weren't just passively accepting human scientific study. They were actively documenting and analyzing this new phase of interaction from their own perspective. They were treating this moment in history with the same careful attention they had given to centuries of environmental changes and social developments. As the sun began to set outside, creating new patterns of light through the chamber's ingenious illumination system, James felt the weight of the moment. They weren't just discovering the horse's past, they were participating in the creation of a new future, one where two species might finally learn to combine their knowledge and abilities to face the challenges ahead. The mare caught his eye and nodded toward another unexplored tunnel leading from the chamber. In her gaze was a clear message. There was still more to learn, more to understand. This revelation of their educational system was just another step in a longer journey of discovery and cooperation. The new tunnel the mare led them through opened into something entirely unexpected, a vast underground chamber that served as what could only be described as a strategic planning center. Unlike the educational space, this room was actively in use by dozens of horses, each engaged in what appeared to be specific tasks. "My God," Maya whispered, her tablet camera struggling to capture the scale of the operation. "They're not just teaching and preserving knowledge, they're actively planning and coordinating across entire territories." The chamber walls displayed current maps of the American West, marked with what James now recognized as the horses' sophisticated, symbolic language. Different herds were tracked, resources monitored, and potential threats identified. But what caught everyone's attention was a section clearly dedicated to human activity and its environmental impact. The mare approached one of the larger maps, indicating a pattern of markings that spread across several states. Dr. Rodriguez studied them intently, her expression shifting from confusion to amazement. "These aren't just observations," she said. "They're solutions. Look, they've mapped alternative grazing patterns that could help regenerate damaged grasslands." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They're showing how controlled movement of large herds could actually help combat desertification. James watched as other horses demonstrated their roles in this complex operation. Some were updating maps with new information, others were teaching younger horses the significance of different patterns, and still others were engaged in what appeared to be planning sessions for future herd movements. They're not just surviving in our world, James realized. They're actively working to heal it. They've understood the environmental challenges we're facing before we did, and they've been developing strategies to address them. His phone buzzed. With an urgent message from Nicole. White House on emergency conference call. They've seen the initial data from the educational chamber. James, they're talking about creating a new federal department, interspecies cooperation and environmental recovery. They want the horses involved as active partners, not subjects of study. The mare's ears pricked forward at this, and she led them to another section of the chamber. Here, the markings showed something remarkable. Historical examples of horses and humans working together to maintain ecological balance. These weren't tales of domestication or subjugation, but true partnerships that had existed in various cultures throughout history. "They've been waiting," Dr. Rodriguez said softly. "All this time, they've been waiting for us to be ready for true collaboration." A young horse approached the mare, carrying what looked like a small bundle of herbs in its mouth. Under the mare's supervision, it demonstrated how these plants could be used to treat water sources contaminated by industrial runoff. The solution was so elegant and simple that the watching scientists were momentarily stunned into silence. "Their knowledge isn't just historical," Maya noted, rapidly documenting the demonstration. "They're actively developing new solutions to modern problems. They've been conducting their own research programs, completely hidden from our view." The implications were staggering. The horses weren't just intelligent beings worthy of protection, they were potential partners in addressing some of humanity's most pressing environmental challenges. Their unique perspective and generational knowledge could provide insights that humans had overlooked. As if to emphasize this point, the mayor led them to a final section of the chamber, where a group of horses was engaged in what appeared to be a teaching session about recent human technological developments. They were actively studying and analyzing human behavior, seeking to understand how best to bridge the gap between their two species. James watched as one horse demonstrated its understanding of solar panel placement, showing how herds could optimize their movements to help maintain cleared areas around solar farms while simultaneously promoting healthy grassland growth. It was a level of sophisticated environmental engineering that merged natural processes with human technology. "They're not asking us to choose between technological progress and environmental preservation," James said, understanding dawning. "They're showing us how to achieve both through cooperation." The mare nickered softly, and across the chamber all activity momentarily ceased. Every horse turned to look at the human visitors, their intelligent eyes reflecting a single unified message. They were ready for partnership, ready to share their knowledge and work together towards solutions that would benefit all species. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the chamber's ingenious, natural lighting system, James felt the weight of this moment in history. They weren't just discovering an intelligent species. They were witnessing the potential birth of a new era of interspecies cooperation that could change the course of both human and horse history. 2 weeks after the discovery of the Strategic Planning Center, the former Bradbury Ranch had transformed into something unprecedented, the world's first interspecies cooperation hub. The sprawling complex now housed researchers, environmental scientists, and government officials working directly alongside the wild horses in what was quickly becoming a revolutionary partnership. James stood in the newly established communication center, watching as the mayor led a joint session between horse representatives and a team of climate scientists. Using a combination of their traditional symbolic language and newly developed interactive technologies, the horses were sharing their extensive knowledge of weather patterns and ecological changes. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said, pointing to a display where a young horse was demonstrating their herd's migration patterns. They've been naturally sequestering carbon through their grazing practices for generations. Their movements actually promote soil health and native grass restoration. We've been trying to develop these techniques for years, and they've been doing it instinctively." The mare nickered in gentle correction, and James smiled. "Not instinctively," he translated, having grown increasingly adept at understanding their communications. "She's saying it's all carefully taught and continuously refined. Each herd adapts the techniques based on local conditions." Across the room, Maya was working with another group of horses to develop a new environmental monitoring system. The horses had shown them how they used various natural indicators, from plant growth patterns to insect behavior, to track ecosystem health. Now they were helping design technology that could quantify and share these observations on a larger scale. "The prototype sensors are ready," Maya announced, holding up a small, streamlined device. "Designed to their specifications. Lightweight, non-intrusive, and powered by kinetic energy from their movement. With these, they can share their environmental observations in real time." The mare approached the device, examining it carefully before giving what everyone had come to recognize as her sign of approval. Over the past weeks, she had emerged as a key figure in the cooperation initiative, bridging the gap between horse wisdom and human technology. James's phone buzzed with an update from Nicole, who was in Washington, overseeing the legislative aspects of their partnership. The first comprehensive interspecies cooperation act was moving through Congress with unprecedented bipartisan support. The horses' demonstrated ability to aid in environmental restoration and climate change mitigation had turned even the most skeptical politicians into advocates. But it wasn't just environmental work that was progressing. In another part of the complex, horses were working with psychologists and healthcare workers, sharing their insights into emotional healing and community support. Their sophisticated social structures and methods of caring for traumatized herd members were revolutionizing approaches to therapy and rehabilitation. "James," Dr. Rodriguez called from the communication station, "we're receiving reports from the Mongolian steppes. Their horses have begun sharing their knowledge too. It's happening globally. Horses around the world are stepping forward, ready to work with humans." The mare's ears pricked forward at this news, and she led James to a new addition to their planning center, a global map showing the emergence of horse-human cooperation initiatives across continents. Each point of light represented a new partnership, a new sharing of knowledge. As they stood together, observing the growing network of cooperation, James reflected on how far they'd come from that cold night when the mare had first appeared on his porch. They had uncovered not just a conspiracy or an unknown intelligence, but a new way of seeing humanity's relationship with the natural world. A commotion at the main entrance drew their attention. A group of children from a local school had arrived for the new educational program, one where horses and humans taught together, sharing their combined knowledge with the next generation. The mare's eyes softened as she watched the children's wonder at meeting their first horse teachers. "This is what you were working toward all along, wasn't it?" James asked her quietly. "Not just survival or protection, but true partnership, a chance to share your wisdom with our children to help create a better future for all species." The mare's response was to gently press her forehead against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that had become their personal sign of agreement. Around them, the hub hummed with activity as horses and humans worked together, learning from each other, building something entirely new in the history of Earth species. Outside, the Nevada sun painted the landscape in warm hues, and in the distance, wild horses could be seen moving across the terrain. But they were no longer just symbols of freedom or subjects of preservation efforts. They had become active partners in humanity's greatest challenges, offering hope for a future where the wisdom of nature and the power of human innovation could work together in harmony. 1 month after the establishment of the interspecies cooperation hub, James stood at the podium of a hastily constructed amphitheater on the ranch grounds. Before him sat an unprecedented audience, world leaders, scientists, indigenous elders, and hundreds of wild horses, all gathered for the first global interspecies summit. The mare stood beside him, her presence as dignified as any of the human dignitaries. She'd been instrumental in organizing this gathering, working with horses from around the world to share their collective knowledge in a way that humans could understand and implement. 1 month ago, James began, we thought we were discovering something unprecedented, horses with advanced intelligence. But what we actually discovered was our own blindness. These remarkable beings had been sharing their world with us all along, waiting for us to be ready to truly see them. The mare nickered softly in agreement, and across the amphitheater other horses responded, creating a harmonious chorus that moved many in the audience to tears. This was no longer a novelty or a scientific curiosity. It was a profound shift in human understanding of their place in the natural world. Dr. Rodriguez approached the podium with the latest research results. The environmental impact is already measurable, she announced, bringing up displays showing before and after satellite imagery. Areas where we've implemented the horses' grazing and land management techniques are showing significant improvement in soil health and biodiversity. Their knowledge, combined with our technology, is producing results we thought would take decades to achieve. But it wasn't just environmental successes they were celebrating. Maya stepped forward to present the new global communication network, developed in partnership with the horses. Solar-powered stations across the world now allowed horses to share their observations and knowledge in real time, creating an early warning system for environmental changes that was more sophisticated than anything humans had developed alone. The mare suddenly turned her head toward the mountains, her ears pricking forward. Moments later, a murmur went through the crowd as a new group appeared on the horizon, dozens of wild horses emerging from hidden valleys, led by some of the very animals that had been trapped in the ravine on that fateful night. As the new arrivals joined the gathering, James recognized something remarkable about their formation. They weren't just arriving, they were demonstrating their organizational structure, showing how different herds could work together in complex, coordinated patterns. A senior UN official leaned forward, watching intently. "It's like watching a living library," she whispered. "Each group carries different knowledge, different specialties, but they work together seamlessly." The mare stepped forward, and the newly arrived horses parted to reveal what they had brought: plants, minerals, and other natural materials, each carefully selected to show humans new ways of healing damaged ecosystems. It was a gift, but also a teaching tool, a demonstration of their commitment to sharing knowledge. James's phone lit up with messages from around the world. Similar gatherings were happening globally, horses stepping forward to work with local communities, sharing their unique understanding of each region's ecological challenges. The partnership that had begun in Nevada was becoming a worldwide movement, but it was what happened next that truly captured the historic nature of the moment. The mare approached a special display set up at the center of the amphitheater, a combination of traditional horse symbolic language and modern, digital technology. With deliberate precision, she began to share something new, their vision for the future. The images that appeared showed a world transformed, not through technology alone, but through genuine partnership between species. Restored prairies, revitalized forests, cleaned waterways, all achieved through the combination of horse wisdom and human innovation. As the presentation continued, James noticed something in the mare's bearing that he hadn't seen before. not just pride or intelligence, but a profound sense of hope. The horses hadn't just been waiting for humans to discover their intelligence. They had been preparing for this moment, developing solutions for a future they hoped to build together. The sun began to set over the Nevada landscape, casting long shadows across the gathered horses and humans. But unlike that first night when the mare had appeared on James's porch, there was no more need for secrets or hidden knowledge. The future they were building would be one of open sharing, mutual respect, and collaborative wisdom. As the mare looked out over the assembled crowd, her gaze met James's, and in that moment he understood that this wasn't just the end of one story. It was the beginning of a much greater one. The tale of how two species learned to combine their strengths to face the challenges of an uncertain future together. 1 year after the mare first appeared on James's porch, he stood at the edge of what had once been the Bradbury Ranch, watching the sunrise paint the Nevada sky in brilliant golds and purples. The landscape had transformed dramatically. The former ranch was now the International Center for Interspecies Cooperation, its grounds a living laboratory where horses and humans worked together to pioneer new approaches to environmental restoration. The mare approached quietly, her presence as familiar to him now as his own shadow. Her wounds from that dramatic night had long since healed, leaving only faint marks that somehow made her seem even more distinguished. She was no longer just his partner in revelation. She had become a respected leader in the new era of horse-human collaboration. "Hard to believe it's been a year," James said softly, reaching out to touch her neck. The mare nickered in agreement, both of them remembering that cold night when she had chosen his door, his help, his trust, to reveal the truth about her kind. The morning air filled with the sounds of activity as the center came to life. In the valley below, teams of horses and humans were preparing for another day of fieldwork. The horses' natural understanding of ecosystem management, combined with human technology, had already produced remarkable results. Areas that had been struggling with desertification were showing signs of recovery, and new methods of sustainable land use were being implemented worldwide. James's phone buzzed with the morning update from Nicole, now the director of the newly established Department of Interspecies Cooperation. The legislative protections they had fought for were proving effective. Not a single wild horse had been illegally captured since the new laws went into effect. More importantly, horse communities around the world were increasingly stepping forward, sharing their unique knowledge with local human partners. The mare led James to a new addition to the center, a memorial garden established where the entrance to the cave system had been. The caves themselves had been preserved as a historical site, but this space served as a reminder of both the darkness they had overcome and the light they had found. A group of young horses and human children played nearby, part of the center's innovative education program. The site never failed to move James, watching the next generation grow up with a completely different understanding of the relationship between species. These children would never know a world where horses were seen as anything less than the remarkable, intelligent beings they were. "Dr. Mitchell," Maya called from the main building, "the European delegation is arriving early. They're eager to see the new communication protocols the horses have been developing." The mare's ears pricked forward with interest. She had been instrumental in creating these protocols, ways of bridging the communication gap between species that went far beyond what anyone had thought possible. But more than just communication, they had developed true collaboration, each species contributing their unique strengths to shared challenges. As they walked together toward the center, James reflected on how much had changed. The conspiracy they had uncovered, while shocking at the time, had led to something far more significant than just the exposure of corruption. It had forced humanity to confront their assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and their relationship with the natural world. The mare suddenly stopped, looking out over the landscape with an intensity that James had come to recognize. She was showing him something, not just the visible changes to the land, but the invisible networks of cooperation and understanding that now crisscross the globe. Horses sharing their generational knowledge of weather patterns in Mongolia, helping predict and prevent natural disasters. Herds in Africa working with local communities to restore damaged grasslands. Indigenous peoples in South America reuniting with horse communities that had preserved ancient knowledge of forest management. A young foal approached them, one born in this new era of cooperation. Unlike the wild horses of the past, it had never known a world of hiding, of keeping their intelligence secret. It moved with a confidence that spoke of a future where barriers between species were no longer necessary. The mare touched noses with the foal briefly, before turning back to James. In her eyes, he saw the same intelligence and trust that had struck him that first night. But now, there was something more. A sense of satisfaction, of purpose fulfilled. She had not just revealed their secret, she had helped build a bridge between worlds. As the sun rose fully over the Nevada landscape, James watched as horses and humans began another day of working together. The story that had begun with a desperate knock on his door had become something far greater. A template for how different species could learn from each other, support each other, and face the future together. The mare nudged his shoulder gently, in the way she did when she thought he was getting too contemplative. James smiled, understanding her message. The time for reflection would come later. Right now there was work to be done, new challenges to face, and new possibilities to explore. And they would face them as they had faced everything since that first night. Together, two species united in the belief that the greatest adventures and achievements come not from dominance or control, but from partnership, trust, and shared wisdom. The young foal pranced ahead of them as they walked toward the center, its joy a reminder that every ending is just another beginning. The truth about the wild horses had been revealed, but the real story, the story of what humans and horses could achieve together, was just beginning. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.